Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the 4th Annual Dawson Lecture. It is my great joy as the president of the Dawson Society to have you all here today. We have a wonderful speaker lining up. And I'd love to just do a shout out of my own club of the Dawson Society, which is the History, Culture, and Politics Club. We do a lot of debates, discussion, readings. We're going to be going and singing the Nutcracker here at the end. And our theme this year is science and technology. I'd also like to give a massive shout out to our sponsors, first and foremost, the University of Mary, and then our own individual donors, and then ISI. So I'd like to have Dr. Kirsch come to the podium to introduce our speaker today. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all. My name is Dr. Kathleen Kirsch. I'm an assistant professor of classics and Catholic studies here, and I have had the privilege of serving as a faculty advisor for the Dawson Society since 2022. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. David Lantigua is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also co-director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. He was previously co-director of the Catholic Social Tradition Minor. He received his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame and taught at the Catholic University of America, my alma mater, before returning to Notre Dame. He is author of Infidels and Empires in a New World Order, Early Modern Spanish Contributions to International Legal Thought, Cambridge University Press, 2020, and co-editor and co-translator of Bartolomé de las Casas and the Defense of Amerindian Rights, A Brief History with Documents, University of Alabama Press, 2020. His articles have appeared in Modern Theology, The Thomist, Journal of Law and Religion, Hispanic American Historical Review, Church Life Journal, and Commonweal Magazine. His research interests include modern social Catholicism, Spanish scholasticism, Latin American theology, and the history of international law and human rights. His current book project is on the topic of Pope Francis, Catholic social teaching, and the legacy of Latin American theology for the global church. He is a child of immigrant parent and refugee parents from Cuba and Paraguay and was raised in Florida. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Sorry, I just want to keep track of time here. Thank you so much for the generous hospitality and reception I've received here. Thank you, Dr. Kirsch, for the introduction. Thank you to Dr. Stewart, who unfortunately we keep him in our prayers, cannot be here, loss of a family member, but just so grateful for the relationship that he and I have had. I may have come sooner here, but I had my youngest child was born last October. It was taking me about a year to recover, not fully recovered. But I just want to say thank you again to just the warmth. I've never been out here to North Dakota, this far out west, although this is still the Midwest, I think, until you cross the river, right? That's what I was told. So just really has been a pleasure coming to visit, especially on a beautiful weather like this in the fall, which I'm told is not normal. But yeah, so thank you for having me. And I guess what I'm going to be doing today is really trying to connect history with the contemporary moment, which is what I try to do as a theologian, by looking really at the legacy of the Spanish Dominican missionaries that, if you've come across my work before here, it's probably in that, through those sources, but kind of trying to think about that, the importance of that for today. So. Our nation currently faces a major political crisis. I'm not just talking about the government shutdown right now, allegedly based on partisan pride. I'm referring to the political crisis of hatred towards one's political enemies. It is something the President of the United States wholeheartedly endorses, as he made clear at Charlie Kirk's memorial service. We have seen the violent manifestations of political hatred directed not only at conservatives and Republicans, but also liberals and Democratic politicians, along with their families, like Governor Josh Shapiro and the deaths of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband. We are also witnessing violent political hatred directed at religious communities, even children, as the horrific shooting at Annunciation Catholic Grade School in Minneapolis this past year makes clear. Does the problem of political violence merely have a political solution? That seems to be what our polarized society tells us. If our political party was in control, if our people could just seize and capture certain institutions, then we could disempower our opponents, right? From this polarized perspective, our nation's political unity depends on the suppression of political enemies, whether they be branded as woke liberals or white Christian racists. However, for Catholics informed by the social doctrine of the Church, our nation's political crisis exposes a deeper disturbance at the level of culture, or our way of life. What I am referring to here is not a culture war, which often falls along partisan lines, but a crisis of culture that underlies our polarized political society. Modern Catholic social teaching identifies an anthropological and religious crisis precipitated not by dogmatic atheism so much as the practical materialism of modern culture. That is, a self-enclosed humanism that reduces our aims as human beings to this worldly goods and ambitions, which can take economic or political forms through individualism, consumerism, liberalism, collectivism, communism, socialism, a lot of isms in Catholic social teaching. This modern crisis of culture is not caused by the loss of religion, so to speak, but instead by the loss of a transcendent encounter with our Creator, which has profound social, political, and ecological implications. As Pope John St. Paul II tells us in Centesimus Annus, the 100th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical, which is seen as kind of the start of Catholic social teaching, tells us the root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who has the visible image of the invisible God, is therefore, by his very nature, the subject of rights which no one may violate. No individual, group, class, nation, or state, not even the majority of a social body may violate these rights by going against the minority, by isolating, oppressing, or exploiting it, or by attempting to annihilate it. Even democracies that deny the truth about the transcendent dignity of the human person can become, in the words of John Paul II, open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. The wisdom of John Paul II and Catholic social teaching here reveals the need to get beyond politics and get beyond merely political solutions to address our crisis of culture. For this task, the authentic witness of the Church is essential, a fact that was recognized by Christopher Dawson. Back in 1939, when Nazi Germany had invaded Poland and Mein Kampf was just translated into English, Dawson wrote in his book, published that year, Beyond Politics, "The greatest service the Church can render to Western civilization at the present time is to keep her own inheritance intact and not to allow her witness to be obscured by letting herself be used as the instrument of secular powers and politics." Dawson's insight about the prophetic service of ecclesial faith remains as relevant as ever in our times. Authentic witness demands a proclamation of the true gospel. Nevertheless, what criteria should we be using to discern the true gospel from a false one? This is not a new question, but one that has faced the church since the time of the apostles, and one that became especially relevant in the Spanish expansion to the Americas over 500 years ago. John Paul II, though, has given us an important criterion when he taught that the social doctrine of the church is an essential aspect of evangelization in today's world, or the new evangelization. Catholic social doctrine, he said, points out the direct consequences of that message, that is, of the social doctrine, in the life of society, and situates daily work and struggles for justice in the context of bearing witness to Christ the Savior. He continues to say, "This doctrine is likewise a source of unity and peace in dealing with the conflicts which inevitably arise in social and economic life. Thus, it is possible to meet these new situations without degrading the human person's transcendent dignity, either in oneself or in one's adversaries, and to direct those situations towards just solutions. Those are the words of John Paul II in Centesimus Annus. To respect the dignity of our adversaries and our political enemies is precisely what is needed today in our polarized society. However, the question remains more urgent. How do we get beyond politics in talking about our crisis? In this lecture, I'm going to bring together certain elements from the Church's social doctrine to aid in the effort of reconsidering the roots of our modern crisis of culture, yet do so with an American accent. América in the big sense. If you go to Latin America, there is only one América. It's one continent, right? The North and South, not the two that we're familiar with. So I'm using América in that sense, the large continent. By drawing on examples, experiences, and events from this side of the Atlantic, why turn to the Americas, or América? Well, the answer is quite simple. The Americas have become a new source church for Catholicism around the world. American Catholicism, with one large foot in the global south and the other in the north, stands out in sheer numbers, with about 660 million baptized members. That means nearly half of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics are in the Americas. Of the top 5 countries in the world having the largest Catholic population, 3 of them are from our American continent: Brazil, Mexico, and the US. Is it really that surprising that we have 2 popes from the Americas, Francis and now Leo XIV, both of whom have been shaped by the Latin American model of missionary discipleship? John Paul II was profoundly indebted to the prophetic witness of the church in Latin America that has informed the substance and style of the papacies of both Francis and Leo. Centesimus Annus, which I referred to earlier, sometimes read in the United States as a papal endorsement of capitalism's victory after the fall of the Soviet Union, shows important features of the Latin American church and its theology throughout the whole social encyclical. The preferential option for the poor, the idolatry of the market, and the new evangelization were all important and all contentious themes of the Latin American church after the Second Vatican Council, which met from 1962 to 1965. John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, deployed these themes that I just mentioned in a prophetic way to renew Catholic social teaching for the universal church. Given the unique history of the church in the New World, John Paul II was acutely aware of the specific challenges and crisis facing people of faith in this part of the world. We see him taking up these themes of the preferential love for the poor, the new evangelization, and market idolatry in his letter, Ecclesia in America, written just before the end of the millennium. So in 1999, John Paul II wrote a series of apostolic exhortations to each of the following 5 continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, Oceania, and America, right? Following the respective synodal assemblies of bishops on the theme of the new evangelization. Now, again, what's striking here is that John Paul II wrote one letter to America. Ecclesia in America makes clear that the letter was a call to a new evangelization on a single continent with over 5 centuries of a checkered history of proclaiming the good news. It's important to note that the expression new evangelization had its beginnings in the Latin American church after Vatican II, and in the preparatory document for the meeting of bishops and theologians in Medellin, Colombia in 1969, which was right after the council. The first magisterial expression of the new evangelization was announced by Pope John Paul II in 1983 to the bishops of Latin America that were gathered in Haiti, where he called for a commitment not to re-evangelization, but to a new evangelization, new in ardor, methods, and expressions. Yet the context of the new evangelization, which harkens back to the apostolic boldness of Parousia in the book of Acts, brings a prophetic element of preaching of the faith that has been important in Latin America's history, which I'll be talking about today. In 1979, John Paul II visited the meeting of Latin American bishops gathered in Puebla, Mexico. It was there at Puebla that the language of the preferential option for the poor, and they also talked about the preferential option for the youth, but that seems to be forgotten a lot of times. It's there that the preferential option for the poor emerged with magisterial force. Another important theme from the Puebla meeting was the use of the language of idolatry to refer to the socially destructive seduction of not only power, but also wealth. One can see the evident impact of Puebla and its prophetic denunciation of socio-political and economic idols in the homilies and pastoral letters of Archbishop and Saint Oscar Romero from El Salvador, who attended the meeting before he was assassinated by political enemies while celebrating the Eucharist. In Romero's fourth pastoral letter on the national political crisis of El Salvador before his martyrdom, which he wrote after he returned from the Puebla meeting, he provided a social analysis of idolatry in El Salvador before its civil war. And as Romero observed, every form of idolatry absolutizes the material world in some manner against the one absolute, the Creator. Idolatry also profoundly denigrates the dignity of those who adhere to it and those who oppose it. It has violent repercussions for human dignity. In the letter, the pastoral letter, Romero wrote, "Every absolutization disorients and ultimately destroys human beings." With Puebla guiding his social analysis, Romero named 3 absolutes that had become idols gripping El Salvador that I've listed up here. First, the idolatry of wealth under the sacralization of private property at the expense of the working poor. Second, the idolatry of national security, right? This is during the Cold War, which, like the Canaanite god Moloch, required daily sacrifice of innocent victims for political control. And finally, the idolatry of popular organizations, especially Marxist ones, lured by an atheistic ideology and a strictly political praxis aimed at violent uprising through class warfare. Notably, for Romero, the most dangerous form of idolatry was money, wedded to an unchecked expression of capitalism, whereby the worshiper of mammon, quote, adores and defends money while despising and maligning the dignity of others, end quote. An instructive passage from that Puebla meeting for Romero was the following, quote, "When humans concentrate all their attention to possessing and coveting the goods of the earth, those things become an idol and a serious obstacle to the reign of God. They become absolute. One cannot serve God and money, or mammon." This is from the Gospels. Only the proclamation of a new humanity in Christ through the true gospel can liberate and unbind people from the idol of money. Any unprecedented situations in society and culture thus require, according to the Puebla document, a new evangelization. Now, returning back to John Paul II's Ecclesia in America, the most prominent social and cultural feature of the contemporary world has been globalization and its economic dimensions. The letter indicates that although the phenomenon of globalization is not exclusively American, it is more obvious and has greater repercussions in America. While attentive to certain positive aspects of global communications and new economic opportunities, John Paul II issued mostly a dire warning against the negative dimensions of a globalization ruled, he said, merely by the laws of the market applied to suit the powerful, the result of which produces the absolutizing of the economy, unemployment, reduction and deterioration of public services, the destruction of the environment, natural resources, the growing distance between the rich and the poor, unfair competition, which puts the poor nations in a situation of ever-increasing inferiority. What John Paul II described here in critical terms as an aggressive economic globalization, he referred to later in the document as neoliberalism. And as he warned here in this passage I have from Ecclesia in America, more and more in many countries of America, a system known as neoliberalism prevails, based on a purely economic conception of man. This system considers profit and the law of the market as its only parameters, to the detriment of the dignity and the respect due to individuals and peoples, At times, this system has become the ideological justification for certain attitudes and behavior in the social and political spheres, leading to the neglect of the weaker members of society. Indeed, the poor are becoming ever more numerous, victims of specific policies and structures which are often unjust. Evidently, Pope John Paul II's letter to the church on the American continent recognized that a purely economic view of humans attacks the dignity of the poor, and it's a kind of causative force impacting not only society but also politics and the environment. Consequently, he said, the globalized economy must be analyzed in the light of the principles of social justice, respecting the preferential option for the poor, who must be allowed to take their place in such an economy, and the requirements of the international common good. Pope Francis identified neoliberalism specifically for the first time in a social encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, which came out during the pandemic. And it's all the more revealing that that encyclical was written by a Jesuit pope from Latin America, and who had gone through the policies of neoliberalism and been impacted directly in Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America. So Fratelli Tutti, which was written during the pandemic, it was a time in which we witnessed major market cap increases of global conglomerates, of big tech. And it's in this document that Francis rebukes what he calls the dogma of neoliberal faith, whereby the marketplace by itself is believed to resolve every problem. To speak of the dogma of neoliberal faith accentuates the danger and seduction of a false faith that places human trust in what Francis called the new idolatry of money, or as he also called it, like Romero, Dios dinero, the money god. We are at the dawn of an age of trillionaires, when wealth and disparity are both increasing exponentially. The neoliberal fantasy of weakening political power through private interests is evident by the fact that of the 100 largest global economic entities in terms of revenue, only 31 are nations, 69 are corporations. Pope Francis's reference to neoliberalism as an expression of faith, albeit a false one, makes a very deliberate point, right? For Francis, secularism has more to do with individualistic materialism shaping culture and less about the subtraction of God or sacred images from the public square. Francis has warned against a new self-centered paganism. And in his document, Evangelii Gaudium in particular, his first apostolic exhortation, where he offers a kind of plan for missionary discipleship, he says, "Today our challenge is not so much atheism as the need to respond adequately to many people's thirst for God, lest they try to satisfy it with alienating solutions or with a disembodied Jesus who demands nothing of us with regard to others." Like St. John Paul II, Francis taught that if the social dimension of evangelization is not properly brought out, there is a constant risk of distorting the authentic and integral meaning of the mission of evangelization. Francis's first encyclical, Lumen Fide, which he completed from his predecessor Benedict, claimed that the opposite of faith is idolatry, or polytheism. Of course, this is a view long held in the biblical history of Israel. The importance of idolatry critique was a mainstay of Francis's papacy and social teachings. And Francis's attention to the cultural crisis of the modern West and its obsession with wealth accumulation has made him a figure often misunderstood, sometimes reviled, especially in the Anglophone world. That money has the greatest power in the modern world is a view that has long marked the thinking of Francis, or Bergoglio, going back to when he was Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires. In one of his many messages to educators, Cardinal Bergoglio extrapolated the meaning of serving God over mammon, which is not merely a matter of personal asceticism. The challenge of mammon to human dignity is far greater in today's world with statistics, stochastics, and now codes and algorithms gauging human achievement and manipulating human relations. Bergoglio taught to a group of educators, which I have up here, this quote: "Money is the universal measure of all things in the modern world. Everything has a price. The intrinsic value of each thing is given a number. The measure of each human being is God, not money. That is the meaning of transcendent dignity. People cannot be counted or valued as numbers. It is not possible to reduce people to a common denominator, numerical or otherwise, among themselves or in relation to other worldly things." Bergoglio, or Francis's account of the modern crisis of culture as one based not on the absence and disappearance of belief in God, but rather the presence and idolatrous worship of a false god, has deep roots in the Latin American church, which I now turn, moving more historically. There's no earlier example of the theological awareness of the idolatrous violence of mammon and the social implications of evangelization in the history of Latin America than the slaveholder turned Dominican defender of indigenous peoples, Bartolomé de las Casas. Trained in scholastic theology and canon law, Las Casas experienced a personal conversion toward the God of life because of the Spanish Dominican advocacy of native Taínos on the island of Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And this led him away from exacting tributary labor upon natives who were under his possession. As an encomendero, Las Casas' political adversaries were the Spanish Dominican friars, who condemned the abusive Spanish labor system and the violence of conquest as unjust practices rooted in idolatry. These missionaries to the New World, the Dominicans, recognized the interlocking problem of idolatry and violence through their commitment to voluntary poverty and their theological training at one of the most prominent universities in Renaissance Europe, the University of Salamanca. Antonio Montesino was the first Dominican friar in 1511. This is after a year of praying and fasting of how they're going to respond to a situation of decimation of the native population on the island of Hispaniola. Montesino gets up on the fourth Sunday of Advent and he calls out, this is actually a homily that's based on the proclamation of the coming of the Messiah, which is St. John the Baptist. And Montesino calls out the Spanish colonizers of Hispaniola for their cruel tyranny and death-dealing oppressive labor of the native peoples, all for an insatiable thirst for gold, he says. The Dominicans combined their preaching of the true gospel with the defense of justice and liberation for the native peoples, all of whom, they believed, were rational creatures made in the divine image, and those for whom Christ gave his blood. The Dominicans preached gentle mercy to the natives, but strict justice for the Spanish slaveholders and conquistadors. Only by performing restitution for the native peoples could salvation be possible for the Spanish encomenderos, who were in a state of mortal sin, according to the Dominicans, due to acts of theft, bondage, and murder against innocent people. Though initially resistant to the Dominicans, Las Casas eventually heeded them after they withheld absolution from him in the sacrament of confession because he was an encomendero. And the Dominicans believed he was participating in an intrinsically evil institution that attacked the dignity of native peoples. The conversion of Las Casas occurred when he read the following wisdom literature passage from the book of Sirach during the Feast of Pentecost in 1514. And the passage that stood out to him is this one. If one sacrifices from what has wrongfully been attained, the offering is blemished. The gifts of the lawless are not acceptable. Like one who kills a son before his father's eyes, and the man who offers a sacrifice from the possessions of the poor. The bread of the needy is the life of the poor. Whoever deprives them of it is a murderer. To take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deprive an employee of wages is to shed blood. Las Casas' conscience certainly awoke, but his process, he actually disbanded his encomienda and handed over his native followers or those who were subject to him to another encomendero. So it was a very obviously difficult situation, inescapable in certain regards. although he woke up at this moment, his process of spiritual transformation lasted and remained till the end of his life in 1566. Not only would he change his views on the encomienda, he also came to see the danger of any material interests in the project of evangelization. He came to revise his view on the enslavement of black Africans as much as indigenous Americans. And after his conversion in 1514, but before he became a Dominican friar under the vow of poverty, he records in the history of the Indies how he bought and sold the crucified Christ in the Indies by seeking to bring profit to the crown. So I read this passage here that he provides in his own history of how even though he had converted, he recognized the injustice of this tributary labor system of the encomienda, whereby the encomenderos were required to instruct the natives in the faith and protect them while the natives usually mined or farmed or did whatever the encomendero had required them to do, whatever services. Even though he left that behind, he still continued to try to advocate for the natives by appealing to the crown's material interests, particularly the interests of the conquistadors. And so he wrote this piece, or wrote about this time before he became a Dominican. He says, "I have left Jesus Christ, our Lord, in the Indies, scourged, afflicted, insulted, and crucified, not once, but thousands of times. On numerous occasions, I have pleaded and begged the royal council to help the Indians and remove the impediments to their salvation, and that they prohibit Spaniards from entering parts of tierra firme, where the religious who are servants of God have begun to preach the gospel," right? And they're preaching the gospel peacefully rather than through violence. "The Spaniards go into these lands with their violence and evil examples, thus hindering conversion and blaspheming the name of Christ. But the council has responded that if friars occupy these lands, there will be no royal revenue. So what's the point, right? You see, they wanted to sell me the gospel, and consequently Christ, who had been scourged, insulted, and crucified among these peoples. So I decided to buy him, promising many goods, revenues, and riches for the king." Right? So this is the compromised position he found himself before he became a Dominican and took up the vow of poverty. Once Las Casas joined with the other Spanish Dominicans, he maintained loyalty to the Spanish monarchy, now through poverty, against the rapacious transatlantic, really kind of feudal system that was empowering the Spanish administrators and encomenderos, subjecting the native inhabitants of the Caribbean islands and then later mainland America. Beginning with Christopher Columbus on the island of Hispaniola, the encomienda system of forced labor commended native groups to individual Spaniards who were responsible for instructing them in Christianity and civilizing them. The Caribbean and American encomiendas largely revolved around the ruthless extraction of precious metals, gold and silver, from rivers but also mines. Columbus, Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro, and the many others who became known as conquistadors later were lured into conquest by their desire for accumulating wealth. With grandeurs of self-importance, combining, you might say, Alexander the Great, St. Paul, we have really kind of the vision, the kind of almost a secular missionary vision of the conquistadors that were coming from Spain to gain material political power, but also to kind of place themselves in the annals of European glory, right? And often driven by ambition to assemble investors and companies of men, they were also armed entrepreneurs who usually possessed the royal approval as political administrators that were ready to invade and conquer at will. Right? So there's a way of understanding them that recognizes, of course, they had religious interests of spreading Christianity, but they were also very clear about their material interests, and there's no question about it. Las Casas directly opposes this method of evangelization that uses violence and the aim of material growth as part of spreading the gospel, right, or material wealth. He writes about this early on in his career, De Unico Vocationis Modo, which was on the only way to call all peoples to the one true religion, where he basically says, look, we have a way to evangelize. It's given by Christ. Let's look to the example of the apostles. When Christ sent them out, he told them not to bring money or purse, right? And when they walked into a city, if they were not welcomed there, they're to shake the dust from their feet and walk away, right? So this is a peaceful method of evangelization that does not use violence. So Las Casas was really attacking what became almost after the Crusades, a new way of thinking about evangelization that could use war and political subjugation as a means of spreading Christianity. And so the model here is, of course, Christ, right? That's the reform, the renewal that Las Casas is calling for, like any renewal in the history of the church. Let's just go back to the model of Christ. What does Scripture say? What do the apostles do? This is what we should be doing, right? And so rational persuasion, gentle attraction of the will, particularly through a holy lifestyle, charity, mercy. These are the things that attract people to the faith, right? And that's what we should be doing as Christians to proclaim the gospel in the New World. So Las Casas and the Spanish Dominicans, they promoted this apostolic method of peaceful evangelization taught by Christ as the only way, and they really kind of opposed what we might call the crusader method or the missionary warfare method that was developing through the conquistadors. What I want to draw attention to now is this there is a spiritual and theological dimension to the desire for money that brings into relief the distinctive character of mammon worship and its overarching power over the one who not only takes possession of people and land, but also becomes possessed by this desire for more. The idolatry of wealth certainly takes on a concrete material object, right? Gold or silver in the case of the Spanish. The English, it's land. And you see that all over the literature in the North American context. Roger Williams criticizes the colonizers, the settlers for doing this, who were kind of drunk on this desire for land. That's their new god rather than gold. So let's look, for example, at Columbus's personal description related in a journal entry from his first voyage, where he says, "These islands are very green and fertile." This is from the Caribbean. "The breezes are very soft, and it is possible that there are in them many things of which I do not know, because I do not wish to delay in finding gold by discovering and going about many islands." Right? For Columbus, finding gold is an urgent and limitless pursuit that displaces all other discoveries of new things. Right? Even so, the expansive horizon of the mainland opens an even greater search for gold and silver than the Caribbean islands, as we see in Hernan Cortez, right, who was part of the conquest, of course, of the Nahua and the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan, Mexico, right? In a letter that he writes to Emperor Charles, "God willing," he says, "more gold will be mined in this land alone, so many mines being discovered, than in all the islands put together, and as many more." By 1550, the Spanish friar Domingo de Santo Tomas, who's also Dominican, wrote about the infamous silver mines of Bolivia and its violent diabolical manifestations. He says, "It must have been about 4 years ago, during which this land was about to be lost, during the Pizarro rebellion, that there was discovered a mouth of hell, boca del infierno," right? This is a Dominican talking about this mouth of hell, "into which have entered, as I say, within that time, a great quantity of people, which by the greed of the Spaniards they sacrificed to their god, certain silver mines called Potosi," right, which exists to this day in Bolivia. Shortly after this Dominican intervention by Domingo de Santo Tomas, who was a friend of Las Casas was back in Spain publishing his civilian treatises of 1552. Las Casas pinpointed the peculiar danger of money as a false god that can aid, I think, for us today in the theological recovery of idolatry critique. In his Octavo Remedio, written against the encomiendas that emerged at the time, right, that whereby Las Casas condemned the tyranny of the encomendero oligarchic class, he writes in this document, he says, "The appetite for wealth, which he observes in the seventh kind of reason against the encomienda," it's one of the other titles of the document is 20 Reasons Against the Encomienda. So this is the seventh reason. He says it's similar to the appetite The appetite for wealth is similar to the appetite for complete perfection and happiness, because by the former one can apparently secure all temporal goods, such as nobility, honor, status, great esteem, fine dress, so on. Aristotle, right, he's drawing on classical sources here for this critique. Aristotle pointed out in the Nicomachean Ethics that people use money as surety for having and possessing all kinds of things, right? Like perfect happiness, which lacks nothing, wealth promises to be self-sufficient. As Boethius wrote, right? Money, therefore, resembles the ultimate good, like God, because it is more universal than the particular manifestations of individual lust or pride. Right? It has the appearance of being an end in itself. Right? And the guarantor of everything else needed for happiness in this life. So I've put up here on this slide for you kind of different things that Las Casas says in this writing, where he's drawing on Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, who make an important distinction between natural and artificial wealth, and in particular how artificial wealth, you can have this sort of unquenchable, limitless desire for more things, and it never gets satisfied. And for that reason, it resembles a desire for God, because it's infinite, right? So this is the peculiar danger of the love of mammon. As biblical wisdom warns, the lover of money will not be satisfied with money. Therefore, no matter what illusions exist about money's ability to secure happiness, there will never be enough. Money has no human cure, but can only be healed by divine grace. Aristotle, Boethius, Aquinas unpack this limitless desire for artificial wealth that Las Casas extrapolates more, and identifying that desire with the conquistadors, with the encomenderos. Las Casas writes, just as the possession of gold and riches has so much similarity and proximity to beatitude and happiness, as an end, it is infinitely desirable, and thus the appetite for greed is endless. Right? So again, that connection between the appetite for money and the appetite for God. The appetite that the love of money generates with its godlike appearance of providing happiness and self-sufficiency goes on forever as a kind of secular, immortal God, you might say. It was a kind of riff on Thomas Hobbes and the mortal God, right? It can never be terminated or swallowed up, that is the desire for money, by a larger political power. Money has an enduring and everlasting appeal, which is precisely why Scripture warns against loving it, right? Jesus says, for Jesus, it's not serving God or Caesar, it's serving God or mammon, right? The choice is between God or mammon, not between God and Caesar. Another peculiar temptation, danger in the love of money, is aside from its universally attractive and divine-like appearance, is that the desire for it increases in proportion to gaining wealth because of the illusion of drawing closer to the end, right? Or this is the argument that Las Casas makes drawing on these scholastic and classic sources. The desire for money is stronger and more lasting than lust and concupiscence. It does not pass with time or exhaust with possession, but finds deeper traction and growth as defects take hold of a human life. In the view of the Venerable Bede, whom Las Casas referred, he writes, avarice or greed takes away faith. It dissipates concord, it violates charity, and it produces innumerable evils. Greed also impairs freedom of judgment and takes the mind captive. This is why the teaching that the love of money is the root of all evils, from first letter of Timothy, remains so instructive. Love of mammon becomes a cause of other vices, or a capital vice in the classical tradition. Having read the diary of Columbus, Las Casas knew quite well that for the covetous person, the desire for wealth even seizes one's prayer life. Lord, implored Columbus, guide me that I may find this gold. I mean, they're mine, for I have many here who say that they know it. To have an unlimited desire for wealth accumulation is to be possessed by mammon. Violence is the logical result of a mind enslaved to the love of money, as Las Casas makes clear in his diatribe against Spanish tyranny and avarice. In what is a most profound defense of human dignity from the 16th century, Las Casas refers to the non-instrumental worth of oppressed natives under the greed of Spanish encomenderos. He writes, "The Spaniards use the Indians as nothing more than means and instruments to attain the gold and wealth they desire and have as their end." Las Casas appeals to the conscience of the crown to recognize how much the Spanish oppressors violate Christ's example, who came to suffer for the salvation of humanity rather than dying for gold. The intention of the encomenderos, Las Casas writes, perverts and transmutes the end ordained by God, that humans were the end of all things, and not that inferior things were the end of humans. This error and reversal of the end has destroyed the Indies, Las Casas writes. Consequently, such violent and mistaken men cannot rule over peoples because they use them like dead instruments, considering gold as alive and as their primary end, perverting God's natural order, relegating rational creatures that God loves so much to what is garbage, dung, and scum of the earth. These are his words. The love of money and gold not only becomes a living god that has the power to possess its devotees, a living idol, right? But it also destroys human dignity by turning rational creatures loved by God into mere instruments for profit. Here, I believe, we see the modern crisis of culture so eloquently described earlier by Bergoglio and Francis with the loss of the transcendent human dignity for the poor. The defense of the native peoples and their right to resist Spanish encroachment and receive restitution and justice from all the Spaniards had stolen was shared, obviously, by Las Casas and other Dominicans at the time and other friars. One of them was Antonio de Valdivieso, a bishop of Nicaragua, who was killed by a Spanish conquistador family. When Las Casas wrote to Pope Pius V at the end of his life in his last letter, he remarked, "The role of the bishops is to, quote, take care of the poor and the oppressed, afflicted men and widows, even to the point of shedding blood on behalf of them." That's the role of the bishop. He then, that is, Las Casas then beseeched the Pope to require bishops to, quote, become a wall of protection to defend the cause of justice for the native peoples who were poor. It is striking here, right, that the blood of martyrdom spilled in this case was not from violent non-believers worshiping Caesar or the god of Mars, but from false Christians worshiping the god of gold and silver. So in conclusion, John Paul II, Francis, and now Leo remind us that, as St. Lawrence taught to the pagan emperor, the poor are the treasures of the church, the poor themselves, right? The church's commitment to their eminent dignity provides an authentic criterion and measure for the proclamation of the gospel, right? And Leo XIV's new exhortation on dilexite, which is on the love for the poor, is a beautiful reflection on this point, among many things. As St. Paul's letter to the Galatians teaches, the church must always remember the poor, to never forget them. And Francis has taught, we may not always be able to reflect adequately the beauty of the gospel. But there is one sign which we should never lack, the option for those who are least, those whom society discards. God's heart has a special place for the poor, so much that he himself became poor. The entire history of our redemption is marked by the presence of the poor. Our two popes from the Americas have inherited the witness of missionary bishops like Las Casas and Romero. And we would do well as a church to be aware of this and to implement this for the new evangelization as we move into and continue the third millennium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, so yes.
Thank you. Some would claim, granted probably Spanish nationalists would claim that Bartolomé de las Casas' claims were false and lies. and that there are other contrary accounts, like letters to Philip II on the validity of what he's saying. What would you say to those kind of contrary claims?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Las Casas' reception in Spanish national history and historiography is deeply contested. Not so much because he was critical of the Spaniards. I mean, many Spaniards were critical of Spaniards. It had more to do with the way that he was used, particularly in the Black Legend, right? The way that his writings were taken by other imperial powers of Europe, mostly Protestant, the Dutch, the English, also the French, who were translating his writings to create a picture of Spain that was negative all the way through, right? And overlooking, like, basically creating a very simple narrative, which, you know, it's true. Las Casas, at various points in his writings, does kind of resort to certain generalizations. In the famous Valladolid debate of 1550, with Juan Gínez de Sepúlveda, where they're debating the question of justice and whether or not you can use war as a means of spreading Christianity, he has a tendency to overstate or simplify or generalize. That's true, but when you say, you know, he was wrong or he was contested about certain things, I think it's important to be like, what aspects of his writings in particular, because perhaps there are numbers that, you know, it's hard to have accurate numbers on anything, right, looking at this period of history. But there's no question in terms of historical memory of Native communities, what they remember. I mean, he's continued in many ways to be respected among those communities, even some of whom aren't even Christian or Catholic, because of the witness that he provided that has remained important. And so I think part of that reading of Spain's history is driven by a lot of current political interests as well. So if we're going to read Las Casas that way, he had clearly political interests. I think it's important to also remember there are ones shaping the view of him today as well. So, but it's a great question. Thanks.
Okay, it's on. Good. I guess my question is, how would you define avarice in terms of, like, I guess a dictionary definition or according to Catholic social teaching? Because the definition I've heard is, like, you know, seeking more wealth than you need.
Right.
But in a certain sense, I think that can cause a certain scrupulosity because, say, if you want more money to buy nice things, in excess, that's bad. But I guess my question is, at what point does that become bad, or is that always bad? Or how would you define avarice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so yes, there's certainly a framework for thinking about avarice as being something that is, and it's not just a Christian vice, right? I mean, we're talking about the ancient world. I mean, you read Aristotle, Cicero especially, you have a tremendous attention to, like, taking more than what's needed, right? That violates the common good, the welfare of the polis, right? The city-state, like, so it has deep roots in the classical Western philosophical tradition. I would say that the category for two virtues that are important for understanding avarice, because, I mean, there's a way in which these virtues are relative to a certain extent, right? I mean, what's avarice for one person may not be avarice for another, right? However, there are objective markers, and one of those would be justice, right? And that's in the ancient world, you know, thinking of Aristotle and Pleonexia, like, you have to have justice, the harm and injury that it commits to others. And that's the way the early Christians, the church fathers, talked about it, right? You're taking, you know, when you're keeping all of these grains that could be used to feed others, you're keeping it, and it's either it's never being used, or, for example, if you have material goods that are never being used, they can be used for people who need them, right? And so there's a calling to share the goods that have been given to you by God, right? That is a check always on avarice. So yeah, I think I'd want to make sure that we're not thinking of avarice in too restrictive categories, but recognizing that like any virtue that pertains to the passions, it has a certain relativity to it. But justice, and I would also say prudence, would be crucial for determining, you know, whether or not something is avarice. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to say, well, two things. First, if I can be forgiven for saying this, I think this is exactly the talk that this campus needed to hear. Thank you very much. This is totally fascinating stuff. This slide alone is worth the price of admission, which is free, of course. But in fact, I'm tempted to take a picture of it, but maybe I'll just ask you to email it to me. But let me try to, maybe this question is unfair, but let me try to bring together, or ask you to bring together in a more explicit way, the two halves of the talk. So how can this slide and the second half of the talk, which it represents, inform our urgent need to love our enemies, our political enemies? Say, I wouldn't intuitively think that, I hate my political enemies because I love money, but perhaps there's a case to be made.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. You can clearly, you picked up on something that if I had 10 more minutes, I would have continued to develop. But so this is very much in some ways work in progress for what I'm doing. So I appreciate the point that you're making about, I think, if I had had more time, I would have gotten more into the kind of the causal dimensions of the idolatry of money and its political implications, the way that Francis and others have talked about. And so I think one thing that is important is recognizing that in our current political climate, right, how is polarization being shaped and exacerbated, right? When we look to the tech companies that are benefiting from this kind of this animus that feeds the endless loop, right? The feedback loop. Like there's a sense in which we have to see how disparity for the Catholic social teaching, the grave evil of modern society, and here it's like in conversation with Marxism, right? Because this is what Marxism and socialists were saying during the Industrial Revolution, right? The grave evil of modern society is the disparity between the owners of capital and the working poor, right? Now, that disparity is going to take kind of different dimensions in time, and in our current political culture, the use of class as a form of analysis seems to just not get the whole picture, right? And so I think this is why the theological dimension is so important, because in thinking about how we're going to achieve unity, right, the way that the church is presenting here is through the love of the poor. Right? This is what Romero tried to do in El Salvador, and he was killed for it. Right? And then there was still civil war. So it's like, well, it doesn't work, right? Well, does it not work, right? There really is a sense in which the church's ministry and its concern and its service to the poor has a way of bringing people together across the political aisle for common good projects that serve the interests of the least. So if I were to develop this more in talking, it would be, the solution here is one that's going to take us to the question of the preferential option for the poor. So, thanks. Yeah.
This is a great conversation. I hope we can continue it. I know some of you need to rush to class, so please join me once again in thanking David.
Thank you. Thank you.
For those who are interested, we'll be having a dinner in the Crow's Nest if you'd like to accompany Dr. Lantigua.